Hey guys, how's it going? This is your favorite lo-fi music glitched up, totally grubby music YouTuber. Because right now we got the desaturated white on my face and the changing color scheme as I record. And today you're like, Duke, I don't see math rock. Next week, actually, very next week, I got you guys. Seriously, I just finished the chart. I'll have to review all those. It's been a long time coming, but today, it's June the 7th as I'm recording this. Actually, it's the 6th. My clock hasn't adjusted on my laptop, but I wanted to talk about it's the midpoint of the year. And a lot of albums this year have been great. A lot of them have been not very great. And of course, I'm less than halfway through the albums to listen to for the year. As I cover all the Drain stuff to start off the year and the year end stuff, and pretty much for almost half of January this year. So I lost a lot of time just getting through all that stuff, and I've had a busy schedule. But I wanted to do a video sort of recapping what we've gotten this year so far and the stuff that I've really enjoyed, particularly because I haven't made a video for this very special person in my life in a while. But this is for my grandmother. Hi, Grandma. I just saw you the other day, and it's likely I'm going to see you soon. But I decided to make this video anyway because I've been putting it off, and I also recorded it before, but for some reason the audio didn't work because life just works out for me all the time, doesn't it? But it works out because I get the chance to record this again. So, and I'm not just going to talk about anything from this year, although I could mention my current top 10, of which there are two like raw black metal releases. There's a screamo album. There's a rap album. There is a like stoner psych space rock album along the lines of Slift. That was my winner of 2021. Or 2020 rather, Uman by Slift. Great album if you guys haven't heard it. But today I wanted to talk about jazz, and not all these albums are in my top 10. One of them is just before my top 10, but most of these are currently in my top 10. And I think, and I'm kind of biased because my education on jazz is not perfect, but I have a lot of these albums here, and a shocking amount of ones from Edition of Contemporary Music that I really, really enjoyed. And Edition of Contemporary Music, if you don't know, is a label that claims to have the best sound next to silence. Is that necessarily true? I don't know. I haven't scoured deep into their repertoire, but I've been told they're great. They've had some really famous musicians a part of them, and this year they've had some real bangers come out, some really, really amazing records, and I wanted to shine some light on them today. But of course, this label does have its flaws. A lot of these albums are just trios of a drummer, a pianist, and a bassist. And with those albums, you probably think, wow, that's not a lot of melodic layers there. That really sounds like the most melodic thing is by far the piano. And the piano, of course, has the most capabilities for the most melody in a piece. You could play 10 notes at the same time. Most instruments, you can play like 1, 2, or like a guitar, you could play 6, but like you're never going to play like a 12-string guitar, and I don't mean like the 6-string with the double strings. I mean like the djenty, like huge guitar. You're never going to play all 12 of those at once because that's kind of silly, and if you do, it's going to sound like mud. To all you djent players out there, sorry, but piano has the most capabilities for the most melody in any piece, and so this greatly outshines the bass, which is frequently undermixed in a lot of jazz releases out there. Look at any remaster of like any jazz album, and the bass is just not where it should be. But all that aside, ECM has some other albums this year that are actually larger ensembles, more like 5 people, that actually have amazing sounds, and they really give you a nice sort of grasp on like modern jazz. And modern jazz is in a super interesting place right now. This is coming from, of course, an uneducated perspective. Take this with a grain of salt. This video is mainly for jazz recommendations this year, but it's not perfect. I'm not like, I don't know, Mr. Sungazer bassman, the lick, I don't remember his name. But terminology that only I understand aside, and let's get to some terminology I don't at all understand by talking about these bands or groups or whatever. First of all, Banker and Moses with their album Feeding the Machine this year, I thought was a really fantastic album. It had a little bit of electronic stuff sort of filled in, and it really kind of reminded me of maybe like Bitches Brew, Miles Davis, where it really was just showing that high def era production could really give a big boost to jazz music if the artists will allow it to be. And I know there's a lot of improvisational sort of flair thrown into jazz, and soloing something really emphasized, and having like that group chemistry is something awesome. But Banker and Moses is a really minimalist setup. It's really just like electronics, drums, and saxophone, and the electronics are really subtle as well. But having that extra bit of reverb on the saxophone is something insane. And this is one of the most visceral, sort of like primal releases of the year, despite having such a high def, forward thinking, and modern eye for production, with some ambient sort of like synths that fill in the gaps that really until the 70s we didn't get in a lot of music. Like you hear a lot of gaps in music because like the wall of sound wasn't really as thought of yet. But this album is a total wall of sound despite the minimalist setup here, and it sounds amazing. It's something you could really jam to. It's really primal. You're really going to be bobbing to it. And you can tell by the track titles that this is something that is really bold. It's really out there. It's really not shying away from any topic at all. And I think it's a really awesome piece of music, really exciting piece of music, and it's something I totally recommend for everybody. And next is Mark Turner's Return from the Stars. This is an ECM piece here, with a rather phenomenal setup. And this is a jazz album that resonated with me so particularly this year. And even though it was a little more of a conventional jazz setup, as well as the other ECM releases this year, it doesn't take away from its power at all, because in terms of like the standard idea of jazz, I don't think there's a stronger example this year. This one really had like it wasn't as like one singular piece of music that evolved through different movements as a different ECM piece I'm going to be labeling here. It really had different tracks, it had different pieces that were all their own thing, but it still kind of conveyed sort of a narrative here. You had wildly different emotions throughout this entire record. Even individual songs would take you to different places and times and have you seeing different people. And I wanted to say that the trumpet and the saxophone on this album in particular had so much chemistry together that I honestly, I could barely believe how much chemistry they had together. They'd do call and responses and stuff. They'd have harmonize over each other, and their tones differed just enough to really fill the space. And I gotta mention the last track here. I was mentioning sort of like these vivid images and this almost sort of a sense of a narrative here. And with how dynamic this album is so far, up until this last track, you got all these different people, places, and things, and all these different actions going on. It really feels like the entirety of life has been contained in this short track list. And this last track is like an epilogue. It literally feels like somber and laid back in a way that it feels like you have the goggles pulled back and you're in a movie theater and you're watching as it says, like you watch through your own eyes as you die, and it says directed by your name here, and then you watch as the credits start to roll, and the weirdest thing is you hear like 2 or 3 other people in the theater clap. It's mostly empty, but there are a couple people there to see this movie, and I think it's just such a vivid image, and it's really cathartic album in the weirdest way, mortifying in a weird way. This thing is a monstrous piece of music, but at the same time it's like super tame and chill. You got everything you could ever want in this album, basically. Return from the Stars. And now an album that doesn't really count, but I thought it was too technically just intelligent to just really ignore. This was a 2-piece band called Inhuman Kind with an album called Self-Deification. This was under Voidhanger Records. Voidhanger is kind of one of those dark jazz labels where they make a lot of jazz music, or jazz adjacent stuff rather, that throws in a lot of modern production styles. It has a lot of albums under their belt that are like death metal, dark ambient, even occasionally like avant-garde or like black metal, but sometimes it has albums that contain similar feelings or even similar techniques, dare I say, to these extreme metal releases. And instead of having these extreme metal releases, it's like jazz. Voidhanger is like big break, I want to say, into the mainstream, as far as I could tell, was in 2020 when Eons was dropped by the band Neptunian Maximalism, which was like a Belgian jazz, dark jazz thing. And I think their other stuff, their side projects are not nearly as good, because this stuff had a really percussive feeling to it and had a lot of interesting just instruments actually. It had like various different instruments from other countries, and it had a really cool droney guitar sound. But Inhuman Kind, with self-deification here, is something totally different. It's a choir, a flautist, and a double bassist, and it's synced up perfectly for the majority of the tracks here. And for the first few tracks, you've got them just completely in unison, and it's this really like dastardly, like sinister sound. But it doesn't feel harmless, but it feels like it doesn't consider itself harmless. It's like, it feels like it's being mischievous, like this very impish record. And what's funny about this choir here is you have a classically trained choir with a very well trained death metal vocalist doing death growls underneath the whole choir, and it gives it a really interesting, like, I don't want to say like bottom end, but a really interesting like support to the whole sound. But it totally turns it more sinister, and it's a way that's like they didn't even have to turn the harmonies into something as shrill, even though the harmonies can be pretty shrill. But it isn't until the end of these tracks here where the melodies start breaking off and snaking away in each other with these really cool ideas. Really sinister, kind of spooky record here. Is this one for everyone? Absolutely not. This is probably the most niche record I'm going to talk about all year, if not like top 5. Like, even if you're into like extreme metal, then you're probably not going to be into this. But I thought it was worth a mention because it's just two wizard-like musicians and a wizard-like choir. And the other addition of contemporary music I'm going to mention here is Avishai Cohen. This is Naked Truth. This is a really interesting piece here because it's got a bunch of different movements. So it's really got the ECM style, jazz style here, full of movements, very third stream, a lot of really legato and formless drums that I think ECM has done to death this year. But this is an album that it felt really successful, and it felt really wonderful, actually. A lot of really vivid imagery, and really nice subtlety, especially the first few tracks really drives home the fact that this is a huge piece here. And I love more minimalist compositions. I feel every day that walls of sound are misused left and right, and that's why like pop music doesn't appeal to me that much, because the best pieces of music in history, they make you hang on to every individual note, and you really can't squander that idea. Like, you can look at so many songs from before the 80s, I would even say, that are over 7 or over 6 minutes long, that really have you hang on to every individual note. Like, you see a lot of, like, just for example here, I know this is kind of random, but the band Parliament, the funk band, you notice that everything that Bootsy Collins does on the bass, you hang on to every note because it's so interesting. It's super funky. But how this piece works here, and how most pieces work actually, the first several movements feel like such an interesting introduction here. I don't really want to compare it to A Love Supreme by John Coltrane, because I've only listened to that one so many times. But it does have a really interesting introduction to the whole album here. It is a little bit easier to digest as a non, I don't want to say a non-jazz listener, but as an uneducated jazz listener. It feels more traditional, and it makes more sense to me. But I feel like it's an excellent way to start the album. And again, it's really dynamic. And I've mentioned this with the other ECM release this year. It's really dynamic, really varied, a lot of experiences shown in this album. And what's shocking to me is this whole album, or piece rather, because the individual movements do feel a little bit disjointed towards the end of the album. Not that that is a complaint at all. It's just they don't feel like they connect as tracks as much. They, of course, thematically and sonically, they very much well connect, but they don't jump into the next. It's not like a clear cut like track break. There's like silence in between. I'm totally digressing right now. But what I meant to say was, for 35 minutes long and 9 movements, highly effective, it couldn't have been more satisfying by the time it came to an end. There's even a spoken word piece to end the whole album off that sort of like captures all the themes sort of played on this album. And as unassuming as this album looks, because I know ECM album covers are pretty abstract, and they don't really depict what you're going to listen to exactly, really tense music. A lot of these shorter movements on here feel very, very tense, and for not being like explicitly like bringing out elements that someone who doesn't know music theory would claim to be tense. It's really just in the texture. It's really in the notes they play and how they play them, and it just goes to show the absolute insane amount of talent behind everyone on this album. I wish I had more time to talk about this album right now, but I'm sure it will show up in my year-end list. And one of the most shocking albums of the year, because I thought this was an ECM release, but it turned out not to be. But it had there was an ECM released last year that was pretty popular, and one of those members was on this album. This is Peter Eld and a few other people with Coma West. Here's the thing: if you like Flying Lotus with Cosmogramma, if you like hip hop beats, if you like stuff that's really groovy and funky, you will love Coma West. To me, this is what Cosmogramma wanted to be. I feel like Flying Lotus listened to artists like this and never really got there. No shade to Flying Lotus. He is a pretty fantastic artist. But if you just look at the immense amount of diversity on this lineup here in terms of ability, in terms of feeling they bring, there's also like a trained classical vocalist here who's really just used for melodic content. She kind of just scats, but I mean, it's rare for me to find a jazz album nowadays with vocals that I really, really enjoy. And I don't mean like stuff that I would say is no longer jazz or like jazz adjacent, but this is a true jazz album with vocals that matters, and that is rare nowadays. It's really rare. And I mentioned electronics earlier. There is a subtle amount of electronics on this album that just fills in the spaces, and it's stuff that kind of gives it almost like a drum and bass feel, like a glitchy type of feel at a couple points. This is a super interesting like art, like a pop art era sort of like feeling here. Like it's really abstract and stuff. Like I just imagine like Greek statue busts in a modern courtyard with like the swimming pool, but like pink flamingos everywhere. And I know that's such a weird description, but I'll leave it at that and just say weird, vivid images like that get conjured. And I think recently, this year for me, some of my favorite music this year has been stuff that have given me distinct images. Like I saw the Primitive Man show, distinct images. Basically, put me in a trance, make me think about something. And I think you're killing it as an artist, but I think that's all I really need to mention today. That's like, 5 albums for you guys to listen to until I talk about something else. And it's finally a video where I get to just talk about stuff that I like instead of stuff that are just essential or stuff that I don't quite like, but it's related to stuff that I like. But either way, hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys are doing well out there. Of course, social media links in the description below. Join my Discord page. I've posted all these and many more from this year. What are your favorite albums of the year so far? Go ahead and comment down below. That's about it, though. I hope you guys have a good day. Bye.